Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. Wherever you are tonight, whether you are settled into a quiet bedroom, lying somewhere in the dark with the sounds of a city still drifting in through the window, or resting in a house that has finally gone still, we are glad you are here. Tonight, we are going to spend some time with a remarkable life, a life lived in a century that both fascinated and constrained the people inside it, a life full of mathematics and poetry, of longing and illness, of one extraordinary friendship, and of an idea so far ahead of its time that the world would not catch up for another 100 years. That person is Ada Lovelace. But before we move into her story, you are warmly welcome to leave a quiet comment below. Let us know where in the world you are listening from tonight, or if there is a historical figure you would like us to spend an evening with next. And if these stories have been helping you rest, subscribing is a simple way to help other people find them too. Now, let us begin. There is a question that sits at the center of Ada Lovelace's life, and it is not the question you might expect. It is not whether she was a genius. It is not whether the notes she wrote in 1843 truly deserve to be called what many people describe as the world's first computer program. Historians have debated those things for decades, and they will continue to. The more interesting question, the quieter one, is this: what does it feel like to understand something completely? To see it whole and clearly, and to know that the world around you is not yet ready to understand it with you. Ada Lovelace spent most of her life in that position. She saw connections that others missed. She moved between mathematics and imagination at a time when those two things were considered to belong to entirely different kinds of people. She was a woman in a world that had already drawn the borders of what women were permitted to think about. And she wrote something, a set of notes appended to a translation of a paper about a machine that would only be fully understood a century after her death. She did not live to see any of it matter. She was 36 years old when she died, and yet, here we are, still talking about her. That, perhaps, is the most human thing about her story. Augusta Ada Byron was born on the 10th of December, 1815, in London. Her mother was Annabella Milbank, a woman of considerable education and strong opinions, known in her social circle for her interest in mathematics and her firm moral convictions. Her father was George Gordon Byron, Lord Byron, the most famous poet in England, and perhaps the most famous man in Europe at that particular moment. The marriage between them had been a brief and troubled one. Byron was brilliant and restless and self-destructive. Annabella was precise and principled and deeply uncomfortable with disorder. They had separated before Ada was 5 weeks old. Byron left England in April of 1816, when Ada was just a few months old, and he never returned. He died in Greece in 1824, when Ada was 8. She had no memory of him. She had never really known him at all. What she had instead was his reputation, and his absence, and a mother who was determined, with a fierce and sometimes suffocating love, to make sure that Ada did not become him. Annabella Byron had a theory about her daughter. She believed that the poetic temperament, the wildness, the instability, the danger she associated with Byron was something that could be trained out of a child through the right kind of education. And so Ada's childhood was shaped by mathematics, by logic, by the firm structures of numbers and reason. The intention was to counteract whatever she might have inherited from her father. to press the poetry out before it could take root. What Annabella did not anticipate, and what is perhaps the central irony of Ada's life, was that the two things she was trying to keep separate were not opposites at all. They were, in Ada's mind, the same thing. Ada grew up in a world of careful routines and quiet rooms. The houses she lived in as a child were large and set back from the noise of the city, full of the kind of order that her mother maintained with great effort. She had tutors. She had structured lessons. She was, for much of her early childhood, educated at home, which was not unusual for a girl of her class and time, but which also meant that her world was small and closely watched. She was not a particularly healthy child. She suffered from headaches and other ailments that are difficult now to identify precisely, and for a significant period in her adolescence, she lost the use of her legs entirely, possibly due to measles, and had to learn to walk again. There were months, perhaps longer, when she was confined to her bed or to a couch, unable to do much more than read and think and write letters. Those letters, even from a young age, had a quality to them, a directness, a curiosity that kept bumping up against the edges of what she was supposed to be curious about. She was intensely interested in flight. At around the age of 12, she began a project she called Flyology, a serious and methodical attempt to work out whether human flight was possible, and if so, how it might be achieved. She studied birds. She made notes on wing structure and wind and the ratio of weight to lift. She wrote a small illustrated paper on the subject. It was the kind of project that a child undertakes with complete sincerity, without any awareness that it might seem eccentric, because to her it was simply a question that needed answering. The question was there, so she worked on it. That combination, the absolute seriousness, the willingness to follow a question wherever it led, the belief that imagination and method belong together, would define her for the rest of her life. London in the early 19th century was, in certain circles, an extraordinarily alive place for ideas. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping the physical world at a pace that felt almost impossible to absorb. Factories and engines and railways were changing what was possible. In drawing rooms and lecture halls and the private libraries of wealthy houses, people were arguing about science and progress and what the future might look like. It was a world in which new things were being invented almost constantly, and in which the boundary between what was real and what was merely imagined had become unusually thin. Annabella, for all her severity, moved in educated circles. She knew scientists and thinkers. She was herself genuinely interested in mathematics, which was unusual for a woman of her era, and which she had passed on, whether she intended to or not, to her daughter. In 1833, when Ada was 17, Annabella took her to a series of gatherings that were, in their quiet way, among the most important evenings of Ada's life. It was at one of these gatherings that Ada met Charles Babbage. Babbage was at this point a man in his early 40s, already well known in London's intellectual circles, and already deep in the work that would consume much of his life. He was designing a machine, not a simple mechanical device, but something far more ambitious. A machine that could perform complex mathematical calculations automatically, guided by a set of instructions fed into it from the outside. The first version of this idea, which he called the difference engine, had been partially built. though it had never been completed due to a combination of funding difficulties, mechanical challenges, and Babbage's own restless tendency to move on to the next idea before the current one was finished. By the time Ada met him, he had already begun thinking about a second, more ambitious machine, the Analytical Engine. This one was different in kind, not just degree. It was, in principle, a general-purpose computing machine, something that could be programmed to perform any calculation, not just a specific type. Ada stood in Babbage's drawing room that evening and looked at a demonstration of a small working section of the difference engine, its brass gears, its rows of numbered wheels, its quiet mechanical precision. And she understood something that many of the other people in the room did not. She did not just see a clever machine, she saw the idea behind the machine. Most visitors to Babbage's demonstrations were impressed by the spectacle of it. The gears turning, the numbers appearing. They saw a remarkable piece of craftsmanship. Ada saw something else. She saw the implications. She saw what such a machine could become, and what it could do, and what it might mean for the relationship between human thought and mechanical process. She grasped implications that many observers missed. Babbage noticed this. He had shown the machine to many people. He had watched their faces, and he recognized, in this 17-year-old girl, something he did not often find: genuine comprehension. A friendship began that evening. It would prove to be the most important relationship in Ada's intellectual life, and one of the most important in his. She went home that night and wrote about it. The letters from this period of her life have a quality of suppressed excitement, as though she is trying to describe something she cannot quite fit into ordinary language. She asked questions. She read everything she could find. She began, quietly and with great determination, to teach herself more mathematics, not because it was assigned to her, but because she needed it, because she had seen something, and she needed the tools to understand it properly. That small decision, made in the months following that first meeting, would matter more than anyone around her could have known. The London that Ada moved through in the 1830s was a city of contradictions. On one side of its wide social divide, there was poverty of a kind that was difficult to look at directly. Narrow streets, overcrowded houses, children working in conditions that reformers were only beginning to name as wrong. On the other side, in the candle-lit drawing rooms and private libraries of Mayfair and Marylebone, there was wealth and leisure, and a particular kind of intellectual excitement that comes when a society feels itself standing at the edge of something new. Ada occupied that second world. She attended gatherings and soirees. She was presented at court, as was expected of a young woman of her station. She wore the wide-sleeved dresses of the period, her dark hair arranged carefully, her manner described by those who met her as striking. Not merely pretty, but vivid. There was something about her attention that people noticed. She listened in a way that made clear she was actually thinking about what was being said, which was not always common, and which could be, in certain company, a little unsettling. She was also, quietly, working. Her mathematical education was deepening. She had taken on a tutor by this point, a man named Augustus de Morgan, who was one of the leading mathematicians in England and a professor at University College London. De Morgan was genuinely distinguished, and he was not in the habit of taking on students lightly. What he found in Ada surprised him. She had a real facility for the subject, not just a polite competence, but something more engaged than that. She pushed into difficult material with a persistence that he noted in his correspondence with her mother. He also noted, carefully, that she sometimes leapt ahead of the logical steps, that her mind moved by intuition as much as by method, and that this was both her greatest strength and the thing most likely to cause her difficulty. He was right on both counts, but that was still some years away. The correspondence between Ada and De Morgan during these years is remarkable to read. She asks precise questions. She admits confusion without embarrassment. She pushes back when she thinks she has found an error, and she is sometimes correct. She describes her own mind to him with an unusual degree of self-awareness, noting when she feels she has understood something truly, and when she suspects she has only understood its surface. There is a quality to her letters that her biographers have returned to again and again. She seemed to know herself quite well, even when the world around her was not quite sure what to make of her. In 1835, Ada married. Her husband was William King, a man somewhat older than herself, steady and good-natured and comfortable. He would later become the Earl of Lovelace, which is how Ada came to hold the title she is most commonly known by today, the Countess of Lovelace. The marriage was, by the standards of the era, a reasonably happy one. William was supportive of her intellectual interests in a way that was not universal among husbands of the period. He did not ask her to put her work aside. He did not regard her curiosity as an inconvenience. He let her be, which was, in its quiet way, an act of considerable generosity. They had 3 children in relatively quick succession, 2 sons and a daughter. Ada's health, which had always been variable, was tested by the pregnancies. There were periods of exhaustion and illness that pulled her away from her studies. But she returned to them. She always returned to them. Ada Lovelace is sometimes discussed as though her domestic life and her intellectual life existed in separate compartments, as though the wife and mother and the mathematician occupied different versions of the same person, each one waiting for the other to step aside. But her own letters suggest something more tangled and more ordinary than that. She loved her children, though she was not always a patient or present mother. She found the demands of a large household exhausting. She worried about money in the way that people with complicated estates and variable incomes often do. She negotiated with her mother, who remained a steady and sometimes suffocating presence throughout her life. She was, in short, a person, not just a symbol. The years of her marriage in the mid-1830s were also the years in which her friendship with Babbage was growing deeper. They wrote to each other often. They visited. They argued. Babbage was not an easy man to be in intellectual disagreement with, being certain of his own ideas with a confidence that could read as arrogance, though those who knew him well understood it as something more like passion. Ada gave back as good as she got. Their letters have a sparring quality, a mutual respect that expressed itself through challenge rather than deference. Babbage had, by this point, largely abandoned the difference engine. The project had collapsed under the weight of its own complications. The costs were enormous. The engineering challenges had proven even greater than expected, and his relationship with the government, which had been funding the work, had deteriorated into frustration on all sides. What he was thinking about now, with increasing intensity, was the analytical engine. The analytical engine was a different kind of idea entirely. The difference engine had been designed to do one thing very well: calculate polynomial equations, specifically for the purpose of producing accurate mathematical tables. It was extraordinary in its ambition, but it was, in the end, a specialized tool. The analytical engine was something else. It was designed to be general. It could, in principle, be set to perform any mathematical operation, depending on what instructions were fed into it. It had a memory of sorts. Babbage called it the store. It had a processing unit. He called it the mill. It used punched cards, similar to those used in the Jacquard loom, to carry its instructions. It was not built. It existed in Babbage's notebooks, in thousands of drawings and pages of calculations, in the obsessive precision of a man who could see it entirely in his mind and could not quite bring it into the physical world. In 1840, Babbage was invited to give a series of lectures about the analytical engine in Turin. The lectures were attended by scientists and engineers, and one of the attendees, an Italian mathematician named Luigi Menabrea, wrote them up afterward in a paper published in French. It was a clear and competent account of Babbage's ideas. It covered the basic principles of the machine, its structure, its potential uses. Someone suggested to Ada that she might translate the paper into English. It was a reasonable request. She read French. She knew the subject better than almost anyone. A translation would make the material available to an English-speaking audience that would not otherwise have access to it. She agreed. She began the work. And then something happened that changed the nature of the project entirely. As she worked through the translation, she found herself writing notes in the margins, clarifications, extensions, places where Menabrea had described something correctly, but had not fully explored its implications. She had thoughts, specific, technical, original thoughts, about what the machine could do and how it could be made to do it. She wrote to Babbage. She told him she had been adding annotations. Babbage's response was immediate. Why had she not simply written an original paper herself? It is a question that tells you something about how Ada was positioned in the intellectual world of her time. Writing a translation was acceptable. Writing a commentary or annotation was a step further, but still defensible. Writing an original scientific paper as a woman in 1843 was something different. It was not impossible. There were women who had done it, but it required a particular kind of confidence and a particular kind of willingness to put oneself forward in a way that the conventions of the era made costly for women in ways it did not for men. Ada chose to write the notes. She chose to include them with the translation, and she expanded them until they were, in the end, significantly longer than the paper they accompanied. The work she did over the months that followed was genuinely demanding. She and Babbage wrote back and forth at speed, sometimes daily. She sent him sections. He sent corrections. She pushed back on some of them. She asked him to explain things she did not yet understand. She worked through the mathematics herself, checking and rechecking. The letters from this period have an urgency to them that is different from her earlier correspondence. There is a sense of someone working against time, not because a deadline was pressing in a formal sense, but because the ideas were pressing, because she could feel the shape of what she was trying to say, and she needed to get it down clearly. She was, at the same time, unwell. Her health was deteriorating in ways that were not yet fully alarming, but that cast a shadow nonetheless. She pushed through it. She did not have the luxury of waiting until she felt better, because she worked despite recurring illness, rarely waiting for better health before continuing. The notes she produced are remarkable for several reasons. They explain the analytical engine with a clarity that Babbage himself had not managed in his own writing. Babbage was brilliant, but not always legible. And Ada's gift for making difficult ideas accessible without losing their precision was real and valuable. They describe the difference between the difference engine and the analytical engine in terms that cut directly to the heart of what made the new machine genuinely new. And they include, toward the end, something that historians of computing have returned to with increasing interest ever since. It is a sequence of operations, a set of instructions describing how the analytical engine could be used to calculate a specific series of numbers known as the Bernoulli numbers. It is laid out in a way that maps, in its essential structure, onto what we would today call a computer program. It accounts for the machine's operations in sequence, considers the conditions under which certain steps would be repeated, and works through the logic with a care that goes well beyond illustration. Whether this constitutes the world's first computer program is a question that researchers continue to discuss carefully, and with some disagreement. The history is complicated, and the honest answer is that the question itself may be slightly too simple for the reality it is trying to describe. What is not in dispute is that the note containing this sequence, note G as it is catalogued, represents a quality of thinking about what the machine could do that was ahead of almost everyone else working on or around the problem at the time, including possibilities that Babbage did not always emphasize in his own writing. Ada understood something that the engineers around the machine had not fully articulated. She understood that the machine's power lay not just in its ability to calculate numbers, but in its ability to manipulate any symbols according to any rules. That if you could describe a process in terms the machine could follow, the machine could in principle follow it. She wrote that the analytical engine might compose music if musical harmony could be expressed in terms of relationships and operations that the machine could process. She was not, in this, making a fanciful claim. She was following the logic to its conclusion. The notes were published in 1843 under her initials, A.A.L., not her full name. The convention of the time made that safer, and perhaps also more likely to be taken seriously. She had worked on them for nearly a year. When they were finished, she described herself as exhausted. She also described herself, in letters to Babbage and to others, as proud of them. She had every reason to be. The months after the notes were published were strange ones for Ada. She had done something real. She knew it. Babbage knew it. A small number of people in London's scientific circles read the translation and its accompanying notes, and understood that the annotations were, in several respects, more illuminating than the original paper. But the world did not respond the way one might hope a world would respond to a significant piece of thinking. There was no sudden recognition, no wave of interest in the analytical engine that might have carried Ada's work with it into wider view. The machine remained unbuilt. The notes remained largely unread outside a narrow circle. And Ada returned to her life, to her household, her children, her mother, her health, carrying something extraordinary that had nowhere yet to land. This is one of the quieter sadnesses of her story. Not a dramatic tragedy, but a slow one. The kind that comes from being right too early. She was 27 when the notes were published. She had, though she did not know it, less than a decade left. In the years that followed, Ada's attention shifted in ways that are sometimes difficult to follow clearly. She remained interested in mathematics. She continued to correspond with scientists and thinkers. She had an idea, ambitious, perhaps grandiose, but not without a kernel of genuine possibility, that she might develop what she called a calculus of the nervous system, a mathematical framework for understanding how the brain worked, how thought itself might be described in formal terms. It was an idea well ahead of anything the science of her time could support, and it never progressed beyond the early stages of speculation. But the impulse behind it, the desire to find the hidden mathematics inside the most human of processes, was consistent with everything else she had done. She was also, during these years, unwell more often than she was well. Ada's health had been fragile since childhood. The exact nature of what afflicted her across her life is not possible to state with certainty now, and it would have been only partially understood, even by the doctors who treated her. She suffered from persistent digestive problems, from pain that could be debilitating, from nervous episodes that left her exhausted and sometimes confused. The treatments available to her, and she tried many of them, as people in chronic pain tend to do, included laudanum, which was a tincture of opium widely used in the 19th century for pain management. It helped, in the short term, with the pain. Its longer-term effects on her clarity and stability were less straightforward. There is a version of Ada's story that dwells heavily on this, on the laudanum, on the difficulty of her later years, on the ways in which illness and its treatments clouded what might otherwise have been a mind operating at full capacity. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete, because Ada, even in her difficult years, remained herself. The curiosity did not disappear. The correspondence continued. The ambition did not fully dim. She was a person managing a body that frequently refused to cooperate, in an era when the tools available for managing it were crude and often made things worse. And she continued, within those constraints, to think and to reach. She also, in this period, developed a serious interest in horse racing. This is one of the details about Ada that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, rather than rushing past. Ada became genuinely absorbed in the mathematics of betting, not in the way of someone simply drawn to gambling as excitement, but in the way of someone who believed, with characteristic intensity, that there was a system to be found, a mathematical approach that could, if worked out correctly, predict outcomes with enough reliability to be profitable. She was not the first person to believe this, and she was not the last. The belief is almost always wrong, or at least wrong in the ways that matter most when money is involved. Ada was brilliant, but the mathematics of horse racing involves variables that resist the kind of systematic treatment she was trying to apply to them. The outcomes are shaped by factors that cannot be fully quantified. The condition of a horse on a particular morning, the decisions made by a jockey in a specific moment, the small accumulation of unpredictable chance that makes sport what it is. She lost money, considerably more than she could comfortably afford to lose. She borrowed. She became entangled in financial difficulties that she tried for a time to conceal from William. She was not the only person of her class and era to find themselves in this position. Gambling debts were a familiar feature of aristocratic life in 19th century England, but the specific combination of her intelligence and her certainty that she had almost cracked the problem made the situation particularly difficult to step back from. There is something almost painful about this chapter of her life, not because gambling was immoral, but because it represented, in a distorted form, the same quality that made her extraordinary in other contexts. She was someone who believed that the right framework, applied with enough precision, could reveal the hidden order underneath a complex surface. That was exactly the right way to think about the analytical engine. It was not the right way to think about horse racing. And Ada, for all her self-awareness in other domains, could not quite see the difference. She eventually told William. He helped to manage the situation with the steady patience that characterized his approach to most things in their marriage. The debts were addressed. The immediate crisis passed. But the episode left traces. In her health, in her relationships, in the particular exhaustion that comes from having spent significant energy on something that ultimately led nowhere. Through all of this, she continued to write letters. This is one of the things that stays with you when you spend time in the history of Ada Lovelace's life. The letters. There are hundreds of them. To Babbage, to her mother, to William, to scientists and friends, and occasionally to strangers who had written to her about something that interested her. The letters are where her voice is most clearly preserved, and the voice in them is consistent across decades. Curious, direct, sometimes impatient, often generous, always reaching toward the next question. Her relationship with her mother remained one of the central and most complicated threads of her life. Annabella was devoted to Ada in a way that expressed itself, often through control. She managed Ada's affairs during periods of illness. She held opinions about Ada's friends and her choices, and her reading material that she was not shy about sharing. She was present, always, in ways that Ada sometimes welcomed and sometimes found suffocating. And yet Ada's letters to her mother are, in the main, warm. There is a tenderness there that coexists with the friction. Ada understood, at some level, that her mother's severity had come from a place of love, a fierce, anxious, imperfect love, but love nonetheless. She could be exasperated by Annabella without ceasing to feel connected to her. The ghost of Byron moved through the relationship between them in ways that were never fully spoken. Ada was curious about her father. How could she not be? He was one of the most famous men in Europe, and she had never known him. She read his poetry. She looked perhaps for herself in it. She asked questions about him, carefully. Annabella answered those questions with a complexity shaped by decades of grief and anger, and the particular difficulty of having loved someone who had also hurt her. Ada requested, and eventually was granted, that she be buried beside him when she died. It was a quiet act of claiming, a way of choosing her connection to him, even though he had never had the chance to be present in her life. She never made a great public statement about Byron. She did not write an essay or a memoir about what it meant to be his daughter. It was something she carried privately, as one carries the facts of one's own origin, not always consciously, but always somewhere close. By the late 1840s, Ada's health was declining in ways that were becoming harder to manage or to dismiss. She was experiencing pain that was increasingly constant. The precise diagnosis, understood in retrospect, was uterine cancer, though the medicine of her era didn't have either that term or the tools to treat it. She was treated with a variety of remedies, most of them ineffective, and some of them actively harmful. The laudanum continued. There were periods of relative stability, followed by periods of sharp decline. She continued, where she could, to work, to think, to write. There is a letter from the final years of her life in which she describes looking out of a window at the garden and thinking about the relationship between the patterns visible in plants and the mathematical structures she had spent so much of her life considering. It is a short observation, almost offhand, but it has the quality of someone who has never really stopped thinking, for whom the habit of finding structure in the world is so deeply embedded that it continues even when the body is failing, even when the future has narrowed to something close and small. She died on the 27th of November, 1852. She was 36 years old. William was with her. Her mother had been present through much of the final weeks, nursing her with a devotion that was absolute, whatever its earlier complications. Ada had asked near the end to make a confession to Babbage, to tell him something, some piece of information about the nature of their dealings that he subsequently refused to disclose to anyone. What it was remains unknown. Babbage took it with him, and it has never been recovered. It is one of those small historical gaps that opens a door onto a room you cannot quite see into. She was buried, as she had wished, beside her father in the church of St. Mary Magdalene in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire. Father and daughter, side by side, that they had never really been together in life. It is a quietly affecting image. Two people connected by blood and by the particular quality of minds that refuse to stay within the boundaries drawn around them, separated by almost everything else, reunited finally in the way that only the dead can be reunited. Without the complications of the living, the world moved on, as it does. Babbage lived for another 2 decades after Ada's death. He continued to work on the Analytical Engine. He never completed it. The machine remained, as it had always been, a vision more fully realized in his notebooks than in metal and wood. He mourned Ada. He kept her portrait. He referred to her, in his memoirs, with a warmth that was not always his default mode with people. She had understood him in a way that very few others had, and he knew it. The notes she had written, Note G, with its sequence of operations, its careful logic, its glimpse of something that would take another century to fully arrive, were not widely read in the years that followed her death. They sat in the record. They were known to those who studied the history of Babbage's work, but Babbage's work itself was not widely studied because the machine had never been built and the practical applications had never been demonstrated. The ideas remained ideas. And then, slowly, the world began to catch up. It happened in stages. Over the course of the 20th century, the development of actual computing machines, first mechanical, then electronic, brought renewed interest in the history of the concept. People began to ask, who had thought about this first? Who had understood what a programmable machine could do before such machines existed? The name Charles Babbage was recovered, and with it, Ada's notes were recovered too. In 1953, exactly a century after her death, her notes were republished. The computing world was, by this point, a real and growing thing. Electronic computers existed. Programmers existed, though the field was new and its vocabulary was still being invented. People reading Ada's notes for the first time found, to their considerable surprise, that she had described things with a precision that mapped directly onto problems and concepts they were working on themselves. The idea of a loop, a set of operations repeated until a condition is met, was there. The understanding that a machine operating on symbols was not limited to numbers was there. The recognition that the power of such a machine lay in its generality, in its ability to be instructed to do different things, was there. She had seen it in 1843, without a machine to test her ideas on, without a working prototype, without a community of fellow thinkers working on the same problems, without any of the infrastructure that makes it easier to think clearly about something. She had seen it from the inside of an idea, which is the hardest place from which to see anything clearly. The question of how much credit to give her has been, as mentioned, a subject of debate. Some historians have argued that Babbage deserves more of the recognition that has flowed toward Ada. And there is something to this. He designed the machine. He spent his life on it. And some of the mathematical content in the notes was developed in correspondence with him, rather than purely independently. Others have argued that Ada's contribution was more original than the modest framing of her own era allowed her to claim. The honest position is probably somewhere in the middle, and the middle, in this case, is still remarkable. What is not really in dispute is this. She was the first person to publish a clear account of what a programmable computing machine could do. She did it at a time when no such machine existed. She did it in a form that was readable and precise, and as it turned out, correct. And she did it while managing her health, her household, her children, her complicated relationships, and the general condition of being a woman in a world that had not yet decided whether women were permitted to think about such things at all. That is a considerable amount to have done in 36 years. In 1980, the United States Department of Defense named a programming language after her. It was called Ada. The choice was deliberate and affectionate, a recognition that the person who had first described what programming might be deserved to have her name attached to the practice. The language itself has had a long and specialized life, used particularly in systems where reliability is critical, in aviation, in rail transport, in defense applications. It is not the most widely known programming language, but it exists, and it carries her name. And every time it is used, there is a quiet thread running back to a woman sitting in a candlelit room in 1843, writing notes in the margins of someone else's paper, following a question that the world was not yet ready to ask with her. There is something that stays with me about Ada Lovelace, and it is not the famous note, or the debate about whether she deserves the title she has been given. It is the image of her working, the letters flying between her and Babbage in the months when she was finishing the notes, the careful checking of the mathematics, the pushing past the pain, the absolute seriousness with which she took an idea that most of the world around her would have considered, at best, an interesting curiosity. She did not treat it as a curiosity. She treated it as something that mattered. And she was right. That quality of taking an idea seriously before the world has agreed that it deserves to be taken seriously is rarer than it sounds. It requires a particular kind of self-trust, a willingness to follow your own understanding somewhere that other people have not yet gone. Ada had it. She had it despite her mother's careful management of her education, despite her father's absence, despite her health, despite the conventions of a world that had drawn careful lines around what she was permitted to be. She followed the question anyway, all the way to the edge of it. There is a particular kind of legacy that belongs to people who were right too early. It is different from the legacy of those who were recognized in their own time, celebrated, given the rooms and the resources and the audiences that their ideas deserved. It is quieter, more complicated. It carries within it a kind of retroactive grief, a sense, when you look back at it, of what might have been possible if the world had been paying closer attention. Ada Lovelace belongs to that category. But her story, examined carefully, is not only a story of what was missed or delayed, it is also a story of what survived. Ideas have a way of outlasting the conditions that produce them if they are true enough and clear enough and written down with sufficient care. Ada's notes survived. They waited. And when the world finally arrived at the place she had already been, they were there. The 19th century moved on after her death with the brisk indifference that centuries tend to show toward individuals. The 1850s brought the Crimean War, the continued expansion of railways across Britain and Europe, the slow, grinding progress of debates about suffrage and reform and the rights of working people. The great machinery of the industrial world kept turning. The Analytical Engine stayed in Babbage's notebooks, still unbuilt, still remarkable, still waiting for a technology that could realize it. Babbage himself became, in his later years, something of a figure of melancholy, a man associated in the public mind with a project that had consumed enormous resources and produced no working machine. He was not entirely fairly treated by history in this period. He had done something genuinely extraordinary in conceiving of the analytical engine. The failure to build it was as much a failure of the available technology as it was a failure of execution. The precision engineering required to manufacture its thousands of interlocking parts simply did not exist in a reliable enough form in mid-19th century England. He had been trying to build something the world was not yet equipped to make. He died in 1871. His son, Henry Babbage, later assembled a small demonstration piece from some of the original components, a fragment of the difference engine, working finally, as his father had always said it would. It was displayed in exhibitions. People gathered around it and watched the gears turn and the numbers appear. And they understood perhaps a little of what Babbage had been trying to do. But it was a demonstration of something already past, not a beginning of something new. The new beginning would come from a different direction entirely. By the early 20th century, The theoretical foundations of what we now call computing were being laid by mathematicians working on problems that seemed, on the surface, to have little to do with practical machines. Questions about the nature of mathematical proof, about what it means for a problem to be solvable, about the relationship between formal systems and the limits of what can be known. These were abstract questions, pursued in universities and in the pages of mathematical journals, and they were pursued with the careful, patient intensity that pure mathematics requires. Out of this work came, among other things, the concept of a universal computing machine, a theoretical device that could, given the right instructions, simulate any other computing machine. The person most associated with this idea is Alan Turing, whose 1936 paper on computable numbers described the theoretical basis for what would later become the electronic computer. Turing was working in a tradition that stretched back through decades of mathematical thought, and he was not thinking about Babbage's engine or Ada's notes when he wrote his paper. The connections were real, but they were not yet visible to the people making them. What happened over the following decades was a convergence. The theoretical work of mathematicians like Turing met the practical needs of the Second World War, which created enormous demand for calculation, for breaking codes, for computing ballistic trajectories, for processing the vast quantities of information that modern warfare generates. Out of this convergence came the first electronic computers, large, room-filling machines that were nothing like Babbage's brass gears, but that operated on principles that were, in their essential logic, remarkably close to what he had described. The people building these machines were, in many cases, women. This is a part of the history of computing that has only recently begun to receive the attention it deserves. The mathematicians and logicians who programmed the early electronic computers, who figured out how to give the machines their instructions, how to structure the sequences of operations that would produce the desired results, were disproportionately female. They were called computers, a word that at that time referred to a person who computes, not a machine. They did work that was essential, and that was, for a long time, largely invisible in the public story of how computing developed. When Ada's notes were republished in 1953, this community existed. The people reading her description of a sequence of operations for the Analytical Engine were people who spent their working lives writing sequences of operations for electronic computers. The recognition was immediate and felt, by many of them, almost like meeting someone across time. Here was a woman who had understood what they did, who had described it clearly and correctly, 100 years before the machines existed that made it possible to do it. The republication did not immediately make Ada famous. That came more slowly, in stages, as the history of computing began to be written, and as the question of who deserved credit for what began to be examined more carefully. Her name appeared in histories of the field. It appeared in discussions of women in science and mathematics, in a period when those discussions were becoming more urgent and more public. It appeared in the debates, which were sometimes heated, about whether the history of technology had systematically overlooked the contributions of women. It had. There is enough evidence for that to be stated without much qualification. The history of computing, like the history of many scientific fields, had been written in a way that made the contributions of women less visible than they deserved to be. The correction of that record, the recovery of names and contributions and ideas that had been passed over, is a project that is still ongoing. Ada Lovelace became, in time, one of the most prominent examples of that recovery. Her name became a symbol, not just of her own specific contribution, but of a broader truth about who had always been present in the history of ideas, even when they were not acknowledged. This is, in some ways, a complicated position to occupy. Symbols are useful, but they simplify. Ada Lovelace, the symbol, the Victorian woman in a silk dress who wrote the first computer program, is a cleaner, more straightforward figure than Ada Lovelace, the person, with her gambling debts and her laudanum and her difficult relationship with her mother and her failed attempt to mathematize the nervous system and her 3 children and her persistent, exhausting ill health. The symbol does not contain the full person. It cannot. That is what symbols are for. They carry the idea, not the life. What is worth trying to hold on to when thinking about Ada is the full person alongside the symbol, not instead of it, because the full person is more interesting, not less. The contradictions do not diminish her. They make her more real and more instructive and more recognizable as someone who was actually alive. She was someone who could see further than the people around her and also make serious financial mistakes. She was someone who understood, with extraordinary clarity, the implications of a machine she had never seen work, and who could not quite bring the same clarity to bear on the mechanics of horse racing. She was someone who wrote with unusual honesty about her own mind, and who was also, at times, difficult to know well. She was someone whose greatest work was produced in a single, intense, concentrated period, and who spent much of the rest of her life reaching towards something else that never quite came into focus. These are not flaws to be explained away. They are the texture of a human life, and they are worth remembering because the tendency to make historical figures into pure symbols, all genius and tragedy and noble suffering, actually makes them harder to learn from. Ada's story is more useful when she's allowed to be complicated. There is also something worth saying about the particular world she lived in. The constraints on Ada Lovelace were real, and they were significant. She could not attend a university. She could not publish under her full name without risk. She could not hold a professional position in any scientific institution. She could not pursue her intellectual interests without negotiating them against the demands of a household, a marriage, a mother, a social position. Every step she took into the world of ideas required a negotiation that her male contemporaries did not have to make. Babbage could be eccentric and obsessive and difficult and professionally controversial and still be taken seriously as a scientist. Ada had to be careful in ways that he did not. And yet, she did the work. She found the spaces, in letters, in the margins of a translation, in conversations at evening gatherings, in the careful accumulation of a mathematical education, assembled piece by piece from tutors and correspondents, and her own persistent reading. And she filled them with thinking that was genuinely original. She made the most of the room she had. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, a very large thing when you consider how small the room was. The world she inhabited was also, it is worth remembering, one of enormous intellectual excitement. The 19th century in Britain was a period of staggering change in transport, in manufacturing, in communication, in the organization of knowledge itself. New disciplines were being named and defined. Old certainties about the natural world were being overturned. The boundaries between what was possible and what was merely imagined were shifting with a speed that could feel exhilarating and at times vertiginous. Ada was alive to all of it. Her letters touch on geology and astronomy and biology and music and philosophy. She was a reader of the kind that takes ideas from different fields and holds them up against each other to see what they illuminate. This cross-disciplinary quality in her thinking, the willingness to ask what mathematics might tell you about music, or what the mechanism of a loom might tell you about the mechanism of thought, was not incidental to her understanding of the analytical engine. It was central to it. Babbage had designed the machine as a mathematician and an engineer. He understood what it could do within those frameworks. Ada came to it from a different angle, from poetry and from music and from the broad, restless curiosity of someone who had been educated across disciplines and who did not regard the boundaries between them as fixed. And it was that angle, that particular width of view, that allowed her to see what the machine could become. Not just a calculator, not just a tool for producing mathematical tables, something capable, in principle, of operating on any symbols according to any rules. Something whose limits were not the limits of arithmetic, but the limits of what could be formally described. That insight was not separate from her unusual education. It grew out of it. The attempt to suppress the poetic in her, to press it out through mathematics and logic, had instead produced someone in whom the poetic and the mathematical existed together, informing each other, making each other stronger. Annabella's plan had not worked, or rather, it had worked in exactly the opposite way from what she intended. There is a kind of gentle irony in that. And Ada, who had a sense of irony about her own life, might have appreciated it. In the decades since her rediscovery, Ada Lovelace has become the subject of biographies, novels, plays, and films. She appears in works of historical fiction that imagine her differently, sometimes more heroically, sometimes more darkly, sometimes in ways that the historical record does not quite support. She has been claimed by different communities for different purposes, by computer scientists, by feminists, by advocates for women in STEM, by enthusiasts of Victorian history and alternative history and steampunk aesthetics. She has appeared on postage stamps and in school curricula and in the names of university scholarships and technology awards. The second Tuesday of October is now observed in many countries as Ada Lovelace Day, a day dedicated to celebrating the achievements of women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It began as a modest online initiative and grew into something considerably larger. Her name, in this context, functions not just as a historical reference, but as a kind of rallying point, a reminder that the history of these fields has always included women, even when that inclusion was not acknowledged. This is a legacy she could not have imagined. She did not think of herself as a pioneer for women in science. The framework for that kind of thinking barely existed in her time. She thought of herself as someone trying to understand a fascinating idea, someone trying to do good work, someone who wanted very much to be taken seriously on the basis of her thinking rather than her gender, or her name, or her father's fame. In that wish, at least, she has been answered. Whatever debates continue about the precise nature of her contribution, no serious historian of computing dismisses her notes as unimportant. The quality of the thinking is there for anyone to read. It does not require special pleading or special context. It stands. What she might have made of the world that has grown up around her name is impossible to say with any certainty. The machines that now run on the principles she glimpsed would be, to her, as incomprehensible in their physical form as the analytical engine would be incomprehensible to us if we encountered it. Bewildering in scale, in speed, in complexity, but the underlying idea that a machine operating on formal rules could process any symbols, not just numbers, that the power of such a machine lay in its generality and its programmability. That idea she already had. She was already there. She would not, perhaps, be entirely surprised. She might be surprised by other things, by the extent to which the world she imagined, a world in which machines could be instructed to compose music, to manipulate language, to follow the logic of any process that could be formally described, has arrived and brought with it questions she could not have anticipated. Questions about what it means to think, about where the line falls, if it falls anywhere, between processing and understanding, about what human minds are for, in a world where machines can do so many of the things that human minds do. These are questions that her century was only beginning to ask. They are questions that ours has not yet finished asking. And the fact that a woman sitting in a candlelit room in 1843, writing in the margins of a French paper about a machine that did not work, already had the clearest early view of why those questions would matter. That is something worth sitting with quietly for a moment, not as a source of drama, not as a call to action, just as a fact about the world and about what it is possible to see. If you are paying close enough attention, when you strip away the symbol, when you set aside the debate about firsts and credits, and what exactly the notes accomplished in the history of computing, what you are left with is a person, a specific person, with a specific way of moving through the world. And it is worth spending a little time there, in the quieter parts of her life, before we let the story rest. Ada Lovelace loved music. This is not a minor detail. It was, for her, something close to a second language, a way of understanding structure and pattern, and the relationship between parts that informed how she thought about everything else. She played the harp. She studied music theory with the same seriousness she brought to mathematics, not as an accomplishment to be displayed in drawing rooms, though it was that too, but as a genuine intellectual interest. She wrote about music in her letters in ways that suggest she heard it analytically as well as emotionally, that she was listening, always, for the underlying logic of it. This is where her famous observation about the analytical engine and music comes from. When she wrote that the machine might, if musical harmony and composition were expressed in terms of relationships and operations it could follow, be used to compose music, she was not making a whimsical suggestion. She was making a structural argument grounded in her understanding of what music actually was. Not just feeling, not just beauty, but pattern and relationship and rule. She understood that the machine did not care what the symbols it manipulated represented. numbers, musical notes, letters of an alphabet. If they could be expressed formally, the machine could work with them. The applications were, in principle, without limit. The music was not separate from the mathematics. It was part of the same way of seeing. She also loved horses, which is perhaps less surprising given the era she lived in, though her relationship with them went beyond the conventional. She rode. She was a confident horsewoman. The interest in horse racing that led to her financial difficulties was rooted, at least in part, in a genuine fascination with the animals themselves, with the variables of physiology and training and temperament that made one horse faster than another on a given day. She tried to think about it systematically. She talked to trainers. She gathered information. The approach was recognizably hers, even if the domain defeated her. There is something almost fond about this, viewed from a distance. The same mind that had looked at Babbage's machine and seen immediately into its deepest implications, looked at horse racing and saw a system waiting to be cracked. The confidence was the same. The method was the same. The results were, in this case, quite different. But the person behind both attempts was unmistakably consistent. She was also, it is clear from her correspondence, someone with a very precise sense of her own worth. Not arrogance. The letters do not read as arrogant, but a kind of clear-eyed self-assessment that could surprise people who expected more deference from a woman of her time. She knew when she had understood something. She said so. She knew when she had done good work. She said that too. When Babbage tried to add a preface to the translation that would have given his own views a prominence she felt was inappropriate to the document, she pushed back. She told him, in terms that were firm without being unkind, that the notes were her work, and that she would not have them overshadowed by his opinions, however valid those opinions might be. He listened. The preface was not included. This, in itself, tells you something about the relationship between them, that Ada had enough standing with him, enough established credibility, that he would defer to her judgment on a matter that touched his own ego. That was not a small thing with Babbage. Her sense of herself extended to her body and to the question of her own mortality in ways that were unusual. As her health declined in the final years of her life, she wrote about it with a directness that can be startling to read. She did not romanticize her illness. She did not pretend to a serenity she did not feel. She was sometimes frightened, and she said so. She was sometimes angry, and that comes through too. Not in dramatic outbursts, but in a tightening of the prose, a sharpness in the questions she asked about her treatment and her prognosis. She wanted to know the truth of her situation. She had always wanted to know the truth of things. She also wrote, in these final years, about what she hoped would remain, or not in the grandiose sense of someone constructing a legacy. She had no reason to think her notes would be remembered, and the world had given her little indication that they would be. She wrote about it in a more personal way. She hoped that the people who had known her would remember the quality of her mind, the seriousness with which she had taken her work. She hoped she had contributed something, even if she could not see clearly what it was or where it would land. She had. She simply could not see it yet. The landing was still a century away. The room she died in was in Great Cumberland Place, in London. It was November, and the city would have been cold, the particular damp cold of an English autumn. the kind that settles into stone buildings and does not easily leave. The light in the room would have been low in the afternoons, grey and softening earlier each day as the season moved toward its end. She had been ill for months by then, in and out of coherence, the laudanum both relieving the pain and making the boundaries of the world uncertain. There were people with her. William, her mother, who sat with her through the worst of it with the ferocious devotion that had characterized her relationship with Ada from the beginning. Ada was 36 years old, the same age, nearly, as her father had been when he died. She'd outlived him by only a few years. In the long arc of history, this seems very young, a life cut short before it had found its full reach. But in her own time, 36 was not an unusual age to die. The century she lived in was one in which illness moved through lives with a speed and certainty that we have mostly forgotten how to imagine. She had been ill, in one form or another, for most of her life. The surprise, perhaps, is not that she died when she did, but that she accomplished what she did within the constraints of a body that had so frequently refused to cooperate. After her death, the immediate response of the world was modest. There were obituaries, as there would be for a countess, for the daughter of Byron. The notices acknowledged her interest in science and mathematics. Some mentioned the translation and its notes. None of them understood what the notes would come to mean. How could they? The understanding required a world that did not yet exist, a world of programmable machines and the people who instructed them. That world was still a century away. The obituaries were written by people standing, unknowingly, 100 years too early to see clearly. Babbage grieved. He continued his work. He wrote about her in his memoirs with a restraint that was not indifference. It was the restraint of someone who felt the loss more than he was able to say in print, which was a fairly common mode of emotional expression in his era and his social circle. He kept her portrait. He referred to her in private correspondence as the one person who had truly understood what he was trying to build. The machine remained unfinished. The notebooks filled with drawings and calculations remained in archives. The notes remained in the journal where they had been published, available to anyone who thought to look for them, unread by most of the world. And then time passed. The particular, accumulative, patient way that time passes when no one is watching it. Decades. A century. The world changed so fundamentally that the city Ada had lived in would have been, to her, almost unrecognizable. Electric light, underground railways, motorcars, aeroplanes, the things she had tried to imagine as a child, working out her Flyology with illustrations and careful notes, had arrived and exceeded anything she could have pictured. Wireless communication, the cinema, and then, in the 1940s, in rooms filled with the heat and hum of vacuum tubes, the first electronic computers. The people who built them were solving problems she had already thought about. They did not all know it yet. When they found her notes, it felt to some of them like finding a letter written to them specifically, addressed to people who did not yet exist, from someone who had seen them coming. That image has stayed with me since I first encountered it in the history of this period. The idea of Ada's notes as a letter to the future. She did not write them that way. She wrote them as a technical document, as an explanation and an expansion of a paper about a specific machine, for a specific audience in her own time. But the quality of her thinking was such that the document transcended its immediate purpose. It spoke past its moment, into a time it could not see. This is not a common thing. Most writing, even very good writing, is of its time. It speaks to its moment and then recedes with it. The writing that survives its moment, that reads with undiminished clarity in a world completely unlike the one that produced it, is rare, and its rarity is the measure of something, of a kind of precision that goes beyond the particular, of a mind that has understood something true enough to stay true across the distances of time. Ada's notes are that kind of writing. Whatever the debates about credit and priority and the exact nature of her contribution, the notes themselves, read today, do not feel dated. They feel clear. They feel like someone who knew what they were talking about. She was 27 when she wrote them. There are photographs that were taken later in the 19th century, after the development of photography, of people from Ada's social circle, of scientists, of aristocrats, of the kind of people she had moved among. There are no confirmed photographs of Ada herself. She died just slightly too early, in 1852, before photography had become sufficiently common to leave behind a reliable image of someone in her position. What we have instead are portraits, painted images of a young woman with dark eyes and a direct gaze, and something in the set of her expression that artists, at least, read as intelligence and self-possession. Whether the portraits fully capture her is impossible to say. Portraits rarely do. They capture what the painter saw, which is a different thing from what was there. The image that has become most associated with her, the one most reproduced in books and articles and the pages of technology magazines, shows a young woman in early Victorian dress, her hair arranged in the style of the period, her posture formal. She looks calm, composed, slightly distant in the way that formal portraits often make their subjects look. It is a long way from the woman in the letters, the one who pushed back at Babbage, who admitted confusion without embarrassment, who described her own mind with such unusual precision, who lost money on horse races and worried about her debts, and looked out of windows at gardens and thought about the mathematics of plants. But it is the image we have, and something of her is in it, even so. The directness of the gaze, the sense, even in a formal pose, of someone who is thinking. Ada Lovelace spent her life reaching towards something she could see more clearly than the people around her. She did not always reach it. The horse racing was a failure. The calculus of the nervous system never came together. The analytical engine was never built in her lifetime, which meant that her notes about what it could do existed in a peculiar suspension, accurate, important, and untestable. She wrote about the capabilities of a machine she had never seen perform the operations she described. She trusted her own understanding. She followed the logic where it led. She wrote it down with care and clarity, and she put her initials to it, and she let it go into the world. 170 years later, the machine she described exists in form she could not have imagined, in billions of versions, in the hands of billions of people. The principles she articulated, that such a machine could operate on any symbols, that its power lay in its programmability, that its applications extended far beyond calculation, are the principles on which all of it rests. The thread runs unbroken from her candlelit room in 1843 to the present moment. She could not see this. She could not know it. She died thinking that her notes might be forgotten, that the machine might never be built, that the idea she had spent her most productive months trying to articulate clearly might simply fade without finding its audience. She died at 36 in November, in a cold London autumn, having done something extraordinary that the world was not yet ready to understand. And then the world caught up. It always does, eventually. That is perhaps the most quietly hopeful thing her story contains. Not that she was recognized in her time, because she was not fully, not in the way she deserved, but that the work survived, that something true, written down with enough care, has a way of finding its moment, even when that moment is a century away. The garden outside the room where she died would have been bare by November. The trees stripped back, the light already fading by mid-afternoon, a quiet kind of ending in a city that did not yet know what it had lost or what it had been given. She asked to be buried beside her father, the father she had never known, the poet whose restless and excessive life had been held up to her all her childhood as a warning. In the end, she chose him anyway. She claimed that connection. She lay down beside him in the churchyard in Nottinghamshire, and the world went on without them both, carrying what they had left behind in ways neither of them could have predicted. Byron left poems that changed the literature of his age. Ada left notes about a machine that changed the technology of ours. Father and daughter, side by side, each of them having seen something their world was not quite ready for, each of them having put it down on paper and trusted it to last. It lasted. If there is another life you would like to hear in this quiet way, you are welcome to leave the name below. And if tonight's story has helped you rest a little, that is everything this small corner of the night is for. For now, let the story rest. Let Ada rest. She has, after all this time, more than earned it.